Week 17, Overview, the Oregon Trail. What was it like to be a pioneer on the Oregon Trail? How fast did people go? How far was it to the west, anyway? What kinds of things did they see as they traveled? Was it expensive to move west? What were the dangers and hardships on the way? What did pioneers do for fun? These are the kinds of questions we're going to answer this week as we look at the everyday lives of the individuals who literally put feet to the doctrine of manifest destiny as they headed west. This is a great week to ask your students to share what they're learning in their readings. All tapestry students are studying the details of life on the Oregon Trail this week, but everyone has different resources that emphasize different aspects. See if you can make time to discuss life along the trail with all of your children this week. The Oregon Trail started in Independence, Missouri, and ran as far as Oregon City, Oregon. The trail wound over 2,000 miles of prairies, deserts, and mountains. After crossing the vast grassland of the Great Plains, the pioneers had to climb the Rocky Mountains. Beyond the mountains was a stretch of near desert called the Great Basin. The pioneers generally set out with one wagon, covered with a canvas top. Most family members walked. Mules, oxen, or horses usually pulled the wagon, and family members would take turns riding or driving these. A trip from Independence, Missouri to Oregon or California usually lasted 4 to 6 months. They would start in the spring and try to make it over the Rockies before snow blocked the passes. At first, the settlers used covered wagons to go west. The Conestoga was the most common, a wide, heavy wagon that could carry 8 tons of goods. It was hauled by 4 or more mules or oxen. Unfortunately, the Conestoga wagons proved to be too heavy for the hard trail west. They had a bad habit of killing off the oxen that hauled them, leaving the pioneers stuck in the literal middle of nowhere. That was a problem, but it led to a whole new kind of wagon called the prairie schooner. This was a tiny house on wheels, only half the size of the Conestoga. The wagon beds were 9 or 10 feet long and 4 feet wide. Most of them had a false floor, 12 to 15 inches off the bottom, so there was room for reserve supplies. That kept the floor free for little children, sick men, or pregnant women. These wagons were covered with canvas, which was first waterproofed with paint or linseed oil and then was stretched over 5 or 6 rows of bent hickory. A man could just stand up in the middle of one of these average wagons. A typical day on the trail involved a 10 to 20 mile walk. The pioneer family got up before dawn, stopped for a rest near noon, and rounded up the wagons in a circle at night. A good day was an uneventful one, where there were no heights or rivers to cross, since long, flat stretches allowed them to go further in one day. There were days when men went hunting for game or when Indians approached the wagon train wanting to trade. Collecting buffalo dung became a chore for most children on the trail. The dried-out buffalo chips were used in place of firewood, which was hard to find on the vast, treeless prairies. Sometimes the children used buffalo chips in their games. The evenings were probably the most entertaining and memorable for the pioneers. After a dinner of dry bread and bacon, or perhaps some fresh game from a recent hunt, the pioneers often enjoyed the music of a fiddle or a banjo, or perhaps a story told round the fire. Life was hard on the trail. Many of the pioneers died before they reached their destination. Sicknesses like cholera, typhoid, and malaria were common and devastating causes of death. Accidental gunshots killed many people. Some died from falling under the wagon wheels or being trampled by oxen. Others were killed after being bitten by rattlesnakes. Sometimes people drowned when their wagon rolled off a ferry at a river crossing. One danger along the way was childbirth. Many pioneer women made the trip while expecting. Why did so many people head west? There were lots of reasons. Farm families back east were often large, with many children. As the population grew in the east, many felt inclined to move where there was more space, more land, more opportunity. The potential of this new life seemed limitless. Also, many of the foreign-born immigrants who arrived on the East Coast chose to settle in the West, seeking a better life. This included German, Russians, Scandinavians, Italians, Portuguese, and Irish from Europe. Others who moved to the West included the Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and former African slaves. Altogether, non-white or foreign-born immigrants made up a third of all the settlers between 1846 and 1880. A few of the folks who headed west did so for the noblest of reasons. They wanted to preach the gospel to souls that had never heard it before. Marcus and Narcissa Whitman barely knew each other when they got married in upstate New York in 1836, but they shared a single vision: evangelization of the Indians in the Oregon country. 2 months later, they were on the road west with another young Presbyterian couple, Henry and Eliza Spaulding. They set out to start a mission to the Indians near what is now Walla Walla in Washington State. Narcissa and Eliza were two of the first white women to travel over the Rocky Mountains on their way to the Northwest. In 1837, they started building the Whitman Mission. The mission center became a stopping point that ministered to thousands of travelers on their way along the Oregon Trail. Though the Whitmans went to the Oregon country to evangelize the Indians who lived there, the Indians resented them and the steady arrival of white people on their land. In 1847, an epidemic of measles ravaged the mission, probably spread from those in the wagon trains. It was hard on the white settlers, but deadly for Indians who'd never been exposed to the disease before. Although Dr. Whitman tried to help the tribe, the Native Americans could tell that many of them were dying from measles while most of the whites were not. Tensions mounted until the Indians attacked the mission. Marcus and Narcissa and 12 others were murdered during this sudden Indian raid. The Whitmans were old New England stock who moved west, but there were many new Americans who took their place back east. Many of these were Irish. Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, but wasn't happy about it. England had enacted laws that prohibited Catholics from owning land in Ireland, so most Irish farmers had to rent their land from Scottish or English landlords. The laws the lords enacted were hard on poor farmers, which meant that many Irishmen were on a one-way trip from poverty down to desperation. The English said it was because the Irish were lazy and unruly. It was a classic case of blaming the victim. Most Englishmen simply despised the Irish. Despite the hardship, the population of Ireland kept growing. As the amount of available land per person went down, the price of land went up. By the 1840s, most farmers had to sell any grain they produced to pay the rent. They used the rest of their land to grow potatoes, because they were cheap and plentiful. By this era, it's estimated that 1/3 of the Irish subsisted on nothing else. The problem with growing so much of any one crop, however, is that it raises the risk of plant diseases jumping from field to field. Starting in 1845, a series of potato blights, diseases of the plants themselves, destroyed potato crops. The bottom third of the Irish population began to starve. 1 million died, and millions more emigrated. The trip to America was hard. Starving peasants had no money for passage overseas. Some landlords paid to ship their tenants to America on what were known as coffin ships. When the Irish arrived in America, they faced hostility and overt discrimination. Many people advertising jobs added a line that said, "No Irish need apply." Other people, like the Mennonites and Mormons, had their own persecution. They headed west for religious reasons. They had often experienced hardship in the East because of their unorthodox beliefs and practices. In many American minds, the Mormons in particular had become a threat to both Christianity and the economy of the United States. They were forced out of several states before settling on the banks of the Great Salt Lake in Utah. Rhetoric students following the church history thread should be finishing 3 weeks of reading about the Mormons this week. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was established in New York State in 1830. Joseph Smith and his followers moved first to Ohio and then to Missouri, but they were driven out of there in 1838 after the governor of Missouri signed an executive order calling for the extermination or expulsion of all Mormons. They moved across the border to Nauvoo, Illinois, where they built a city that grew bigger than Chicago at that time, 15,000 people. In 1844, their leader, Joseph Smith, was murdered by an armed mob, and 2 years later, in 1846, Illinois ordered them out of the state. They headed west to Utah. Things were hard in their first year in the Great Salt Valley. A plague of black crickets attacked the Mormons' crops. There was nothing they could do to save their harvest. Then, one day, seagulls from the islands in the Great Salt Lake began to arrive. For the days, they flew in by the hundreds and gorged themselves on crickets. Then there was enough harvest remaining to sustain the Mormons through the winter. To this day, the seagull is the state bird of Utah. Despite adversity, the Mormons held on. Their persistence in the face of adversity enabled them to build a new community by the shores of the Great Salt Lake. There were lots of different people on the trail out west who went for lots of different reasons. Wherever they started from, the people who made it out to Oregon or California were changed forever by the experience. So was the nation, as new settlements along the west coast added a whole new aspect to America.